close-up on a man's weathered hands, calloused and dirt-stained, clutching a crumpled letter. The paper is crisp, the words "Fine 50,000, a brutal, unforgiving block of text. The sound of a single, slow drip of water is the only thing that breaks the silence. Pull back to reveal the man, Mark, standing on his land. Behind him, a half-finished earthen dam rises, a testament to months of back-breaking labor. The sound of water trickles from its base. Mark's eyes, once full of a quiet pride, are now hollowed out, staring. Jump cut to a pristine, cerulean blue neighborhood swimming pool, its surface a perfect mirror for the cloudless sky. The sound of splashing water and the distant laughter of children. A cold, determined voiceover, Mark's voice, cuts through the cheerful sounds. Mark, VO. They said it was a violation. They called it a nuisance. But what they called a nuisance, they're now calling a pool. Quick cut back to Mark's face, his jaw tight, eyes narrowed. The hollow grief is gone, replaced by a cold, searing fire. Title card fades in. The land was his, the water theirs, the fight. The beginning. The sun beat down on Mark's back, a persistent physical weight he barely registered anymore. The rhythm of the shovel was a metronome, a steady inhale and exhale of effort that had become the soundtrack to his life over the past 6 months. He swung the tool, the steel edge biting into the dry earth, and then twisted, the heavy scoop of soil arcing through the air to land with a soft thud on the growing earthen wall. He was building his dam, not a grand monolithic structure of concrete and rebar, but a humble hand-built barrier of compacted earth and rock, designed to catch the seasonal runoff from the small, meandering creek at the back of his property. It was his piece of Eden, his personal oasis in the manicured, sterile landscape of the Providence Oaks subdivision. Behind him, his 6-year-old daughter, Lily, knelt by the sluggish creek bed, her small hands cupped around a handful of smooth river stones. She was humming a made-up tune, her world defined by the simple, beautiful truths of water and rock. His wife, Sarah, sat under the shade of a willow tree, sketching in a notebook, her brow furrowed in concentration. She had been skeptical at first. "Honey, are you sure the HOA will be okay with this?" But Mark had been resolute. The water wasn't going anywhere. It was his land. He was simply shaping it, nurturing it. He was creating a small pond that would attract songbirds and deer, a place where he and Sarah could sit and watch the sunset, and where Lily could chase frogs and learn to love the wildness that still clung to the edges of their suburban life. He wiped a bead of sweat from his brow and leaned on the shovel, a wide, tired smile spreading across his face. It was good work, real work, and it was all on his land. The first letter arrived 3 weeks later, a crisp, official-looking document in an envelope marked with the embossed HOA logo, a stylized oak tree. Mark had a passing familiarity with the organization, mostly through the cheerful but firm newsletters that reminded residents to keep their lawns mowed and their trash cans out of sight. He opened the letter in the kitchen, the scent of Sarah's baked bread filling the air. It was a generic, boilerplate notice. Unauthorized alterations to property. It cited a specific bylaw, 7.3.1. Any modification to the natural topography of a lot must receive prior approval from the Architectural Review Board. It concluded with a polite request to cease all work and submit a plan for review. Mark scoffed, tossing the letter onto the counter. "They're not going to approve a dam," Sarah said, her voice laced with concern. "They approve new siding and deck colors, not this." "It's a pond, Sarah," Mark insisted, grabbing a glass of water. "It's not a dam. And this isn't a modification to the natural topography. It's a restoration. The creek bed was eroding. I'm fixing it. And besides, they've seen me out there for weeks. If it was such a big deal, why wait?" He dismissed the letter as the overzealous action of a bored bureaucrat. He'd deal with it later. He had earth to move. The second letter was not so polite. It arrived a week after the first, hand-delivered by a man in a golf cart who didn't even make eye contact. This one had a different header, a signature from the HOA president, Eleanor Vance. Her name alone was a kind of legend in the neighborhood. She was a retired lawyer, known for her impeccable garden, her unyielding adherence to rules, and her piercing stare. This letter was colder, more pointed. It noted the lack of response to the initial notice and warned of further action, including but not limited to fines and injunctions. It explicitly stated that the structure, which it now referred to as a dam, was a threat to the stability of the local watershed and a potential safety hazard. Mark's blood ran hot. A threat to the watershed? He fumed, pacing the kitchen floor. I'm literally making a pond to catch the runoff. This is ridiculous. Mark, maybe you should just call her, Sarah pleaded, her worry turning into frustration. Just submit a plan. Even if they reject it, at least you'll be on record. And admit I did something wrong? I didn't. This is my property, Sarah. I'm not asking for permission to plant a tree. And I'm not going to ask for permission to build a pond. The stubbornness was a part of him. A deep-seated belief that a man's property was his castle, a sanctuary from the creeping conformity of the world. He ignored the letter, doubling down on his work. He started spending weekends on the dam, his hands raw, his shoulders aching, the earth becoming a kind of stubborn ally in his fight. The confrontation came on a Tuesday afternoon. Mark was on a ladder, using a hand tamper to compact the top layer of the dam, when a gleaming black SUV pulled up the dirt path leading to his property. The passenger side door opened, and Eleanor Vance stepped out. She was immaculate in a cream-colored pantsuit, a stark contrast to Mark's grimy work clothes. Her face was a mask of cold displeasure. "Mr. Lawson," she said, her voice sharp and precise, not a single syllable wasted. "I have been trying to reach you." Mark climbed down from the ladder, dusting off his hands. "I'm a busy man, Mrs. Vance." "So I see," she said, gesturing with an elegant, gloved hand toward the dam. "This is a clear violation of a dozen bylaws, not least of which is the one regarding unsanctioned earthworks. It is an eyesore and a liability. It's going to be a pond," Mark said, his voice low and firm. "And it's going to be beautiful. It's also going to benefit the land. It's going to stop erosion, and it's going to create a habitat for birds and animals. Mr. Lawson, you are a part of a community. Your actions, no matter how well-intentioned, impact us all. This structure is in direct violation of the covenants. It is a dam, and dams are not permitted. It's not a dam. It's a pond with an earthen embankment. A dam implies a reservoir, a structure for power. This is for aesthetics and conservation. You are splitting hairs, Mr. Lawson. We have consulted with our engineers and legal counsel. The structure you have erected meets the criteria of a dam and is therefore subject to the same regulations. And let me be clear. You have failed to respond to our notices, and you are continuing to defy our authority. This will not stand." She didn't wait for his response. She simply turned, got back into her SUV, and drove away, leaving Mark standing there, a knot of fury tightening in his gut. 3 days later, the certified letter arrived. Mark signed for it, his hands shaking slightly, and carried it inside, the weight of the envelope feeling like a stone. Sarah was sitting on the couch, folding laundry, her face pale with worry. He tore it open. The first page was a final notice. The second was a single, stark line. Non-compliance with bylaw 7.3.1. Fine, $50,000. The number was a physical blow. $50,000. It was a year of savings, a year of scrimping and planning for Lily's college fund. It was an impossible sum. He felt the blood drain from his face as he read it again, the words seeming to shimmer and mock him. This wasn't about regulations or landscaping anymore. This was a war. The next morning, numb with shock and anger, Mark walked out onto his property. The sun was hot on his face, but he felt a cold, desperate hollowness. He saw the dam, and for the first time, it didn't look like a triumph. It looked like the thing that had ruined him. He ran a hand over the compacted earth, feeling its firmness, and a fresh wave of rage washed over him. He was a good man. A man who worked with his hands, who cared for his land, who wanted to build something beautiful for his family. And for that, they had fined him out of existence. He noticed a small, discarded paper near the edge of the property, a crumpled handout from the recent HOA meeting. He picked it up. His eyes scanned the bullet points. Proposed community amenities. There was a line that made him pause. Project Oasis. Below it, a summary, a new community pool, a state-of-the-art recreation center. A feeling of dread, cold and sharp, began to creep up his spine. He read on, his breath catching in his throat. The document spoke of a new state-of-the-art community pool, a landmark project for the subdivision. Below the glowing descriptions and projected timelines, buried in a technical paragraph, was the hammer blow that sent a shockwave through his weary body. Engineers have identified a unique and substantial water source on Lot 48B, which, if left undisturbed, could significantly reduce the long-term operational costs of the pool's water supply and filtration system. Lot 48B was his lot. The unique water source was the very same one he had built his dam to contain. The document felt like a venomous snake in his hands. The laugh that had escaped him was a strange, choked sound, devoid of humor. Mark walked back to the house, the crumpled paper a new, heavier burden than any shovel load of dirt. Sarah saw his face from the window and was on her feet before he even opened the door. "What is it, Mark? What's wrong?" she asked, her voice hushed. She knew the fine was devastating, but the look in his eyes was something else entirely. It was a cold, quiet fury she had never seen before. He held out the paper, his hand steady despite the trembling inside him. "They're not just fining me," he said, his voice flat. "They want the water." Sarah took the paper, her eyes scanning the text, her brow furrowing with each word. She read the line about Lot 48B and the unique water source. Her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, and finally to a horrified understanding. She looked at him, her lips parted in silent shock. They're going to use your pond to build their pool?" she whispered. "My dam," he corrected, the word now tasting like ash. "They called it a dam. They fined me $50,000 for building a dam. And now they're going to build their pool on the very thing they called an eyesore and a liability. It's not about the bylaws, Sarah. It was never about the bylaws. It was about the water, and they didn't want me to have it." The reality of the situation settled over them like a thick, suffocating fog. The HOA hadn't been fighting him over a minor infraction. They had been fighting him for control of a resource he had discovered and cultivated. The fine wasn't a punishment. It was a shakedown, a way to force him to give up his project so they could take it for themselves. "We have to fight this." "Mark," Sarah said, the initial fear in her eyes replaced by a quiet fire that matched his own. "We can't let them do this. It's not right." "How?" he asked, a bitter edge to his voice. "They have the bylaws, the lawyers, the power. We have a $50,000 fine hanging over our heads. They have power, but we have the truth," she countered, her hand closing over his. "This is fraud. This is a public trust issue. We can't just roll over and let them get away with it." Mark felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't alone. That night, their kitchen became a war room. The papers from the HOA were spread across the table, along with a laptop and a stack of legal pads. They researched HOA law, looked up public records for the subdivision, and even found the original blueprints of the development. The more they dug, the clearer the picture became. The original plan for Providence Oaks had a communal green space, but no mention of a community pool. The Project Oasis was a recent addition, a grand, expensive new amenity designed to increase property values and, most likely, give Eleanor Vance another feather in her cap. The next day, Mark took the first step in his counteroffensive. He drafted a meticulously worded email and sent it to every resident on the HOA mailing list, including Eleanor Vance. It was simple, factual, and devoid of emotion. He laid out the timeline, the initial notice, the escalating fines, and finally, the discovery of the Project Oasis document that revealed their true intentions. He ended with a single question. Was this fine about preserving the community or about acquiring a resource for the benefit of a few at the expense of one? The response was a cacophony of digital silence. No one replied. For 2 days, their inbox was empty. Mark's initial confidence began to curdle into doubt. Maybe no one cared. Maybe he was fighting a ghost. Then, a new certified letter arrived from a law firm, not the HOA. It was a cease and desist order. It accused Mark of disseminating false and defamatory information and harassment of the HOA board. It warned that if he did not cease all public communication and pay the fine within 10 days, they would move to sue him for damages. The threat was a clear, unambiguous escalation. Eleanor Vance had answered his call for justice with a gauntlet of legal intimidation. "They're trying to scare us," Sarah said, her voice shaking as she read the letter. "It's working," Mark replied, the cold resolve in his gut turning to a familiar, helpless despair. He was a handyman, a man who worked with his hands. He couldn't fight a law firm. He was out of his depth. He spent the next few days in a fog, the dam a constant reminder of his failure. On the 10th day, the day the fine was due, the HOA held their monthly public meeting at the community center. Sarah found Mark staring out the window looking at his half-finished dam. "We're not going to pay the fine," she said, her voice firm. "We're going to that meeting. We're going to make them look us in the eye and justify this." Mark hesitated. He knew this was a mistake. They would crush him, but the alternative was to surrender, to admit defeat, and let them take what was rightfully his. He looked at the dam, then at his wife's determined face, and something in him snapped back into place. The meeting room was a sterile, fluorescent-lit space filled with folding chairs. About 30 neighbors were in attendance, a mix of curious onlookers and the usual HOA regulars. Eleanor Vance sat at the head of a long table, flanked by 2 other board members. She was dressed impeccably, her expression a perfect blend of professional courtesy and cool detachment. She didn't look at Mark or Sarah. She didn't have to. She was a queen on her throne. Mark and Sarah took seats in the back. The meeting proceeded through its tedious agenda: a report on the quarterly budget, a discussion about new street lamps, a complaint about a rogue trash can. The air was thick with polite boredom, a stark contrast to the emotional war raging within Mark. He sat with the Project Oasis document clutched in his hand, a small, unassuming piece of paper with the power to unravel everything. Finally, the floor was open for public comment. A few people asked questions about the streetlights. Then Mark's turn. He stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. His legs felt shaky, but he forced himself to stand straight to meet Eleanor Vance's gaze. Her eyes, cool and analytical, finally landed on him, and a small, almost imperceptible smirk played on her lips. "Mr. Lawson," she said, her voice a model of civility, "do you have something to add?" Mark held up the document. "I'd like to know why I was fined $50,000 for building a dam on my property, when the board intends to use the very same water source for a new community pool." A ripple of murmuring went through the room. People whispered, their heads turning between Mark and Eleanor. A few looked at him with sympathy, others with skepticism. Eleanor Vance smiled, a chilly, practiced expression. "Mr. Lawson, as you know, all board business must go through the proper channels. Your grievance has already been addressed by our legal team. We have no further comment on the matter." "It's not a grievance," Mark said, his voice rising, shedding the careful calm he had planned. "It's a fraud. This document," he waved the paper, "proves that you've been planning to take my water all along. You called it a dam to find me, but you've been calling it a unique and substantial water source to each other." The murmuring grew louder. Eleanor Vance didn't flinch. She simply held up a hand. The room fell silent. She spoke, her voice measured and confident, as if she were addressing a child. "This is a very serious allegation, Mr. Lawson. You are accusing the board of acting fraudulently. Do you have proof of your claims?" Mark's heart hammered against his ribs. He held up the document. "It's all right here. The official project notes. It references my lot, Lot 48B, and the water source." Eleanor Vance leaned forward, her composure cracking ever so slightly, a flash of predatory triumph in her eyes. "I see. And where did you obtain this document, Mr. Lawson?" Mark froze. He hadn't thought about that. He had simply found it discarded on the edge of his property. The HOA meeting handout. His mind raced. He couldn't say he found it. That sounded weak, pathetic. He was the one fighting for justice. Eleanor Vance saw his hesitation. She leaned back, a cold, triumphant smile spreading across her face. "Let me save you the trouble, Mr. Lawson. This document, if it even exists in the form you claim, was a draft. a preliminary, non-binding note that was discarded before the final public packet was compiled. Which means, Mr. Lawson, that you have illegally obtained and disseminated private, privileged HOA information. And as a matter of fact, that constitutes a violation of our Privacy and Information Policy Bylaw 9.4, and the penalty for that is an additional fine of $50,000. A gasp echoed through the room. The neighbors who had looked at him with sympathy now looked at him with a mix of shock and disapproval. Mark stood there, his jaw hanging open, the damn document suddenly feeling like a worthless piece of trash. He had come to fight, to expose them, but in one devastating, calculated move, Eleanor Vance had flipped the script. He hadn't exposed her. He had exposed himself, and she had just doubled down. He didn't have a fighting chance anymore. He had walked into a legal trap, and he was now in a deeper hole than he ever could have imagined. The silence was a living, breathing thing. It had swallowed the last gasp from the meeting room and now followed Mark and Sarah home, a heavy shroud on their shoulders. The walk felt endless. Every click of Sarah's heels on the pavement was a punctuation mark on the public humiliation he had just endured. He hadn't just lost. He had been made to look like a fool, a desperate man caught in a lie, a snoop who had dug through the trash for a piece of paper that was now worth $50,000. Back in the cold light of their kitchen, Mark sank into a chair, the crumpled document still in his hand. A useless, damning relic. Sarah didn't speak. She just went to the sink, filled a glass with water, and placed it in front of him. Her eyes were red, but she wasn't crying. There was a hard, brittle strength in her silence that was far more terrifying than any outburst. "I'm sorry," Mark said, the words a hollow echo. He didn't know what else to say. He had walked in with a single piece of evidence convinced of his righteousness, and had walked out with his family in a $100,000 hole. "Don't," she said, her voice strained. "Don't apologize. She was waiting for you. It was a trap. We were naive." She sat down across from him, her hands clasped on the table. "So what do we do now?" "We don't have $100,000, Mark." He closed his eyes. The image of Eleanor Vance's cold, triumphant smile burned into his memory. She had played him, used his own sense of justice against him. She had calculated every move, and he, in his stubborn manual laborer's mind, had walked right into the snare. The next few days were a waking nightmare. The emails started coming in, not from Eleanor but from neighbors, polite, concerned, and dripping with thinly veiled judgment. One from the Hendersons 2 doors down, heard about the meeting. "Hope you two are doing okay. We're praying for you." Mark knew what that meant. "We're praying you don't drag down our property values with your legal troubles." Another from the Browns. "It's a shame what happened at the meeting. We're all for community, but rules are rules, and that was a very serious allegation you made." The subtext was clear. "We believe Eleanor. You broke the rules. Now you're paying the price." The isolation was crushing. He saw neighbors he'd waved to for years now looking away when he passed. He saw children who had once played in his yard now being called inside by their parents. He was an outcast, the man who had tried to steal from the community and had been rightfully punished. Mark stopped working on the dam. He couldn't bring himself to look at it. It was no longer a project of love, but a monument to his colossal failure. The fines were due in 30 days, and the thought of them felt like a physical weight, pressing down on his chest. He researched bankruptcy, but Sarah refused to even consider it. "We're not giving up the house, Mark. This is our home, our sanctuary. We will find a way." A week after the meeting, as Mark was weeding the front lawn, a golf cart rumbled to a stop on the curb. The driver was an old man with a shock of white hair and a kind, wrinkled face. It was Mr. Henderson, the neighbor who had sent the prayerful email. Mark braced himself for another well-meaning lecture. "Mark," Henderson said, his voice a gentle rumble, "you've been out here every day for an hour since the meeting. I want to talk to you." Mark straightened up, pulling off his gardening gloves. "I appreciate the concern, Mr. Henderson, but there's nothing to talk about. The fine is what it is." "I'm not talking about the fine," Henderson said, his eyes scanning the empty street, a strange look of furtive caution on his face. He leaned in closer. "I was at the meeting. I've been on the board for 20 years. I resigned 6 months ago after Eleanor took over. I know her. I saw what she did to you, and I saw the look on your face. You were telling the truth. I saw the document. Mark's jaw tightened. And what good does that do us? She said it was a private, privileged document, and now we owe another 50 grand for having it. We can't fight her. She's a lawyer, Mr. Henderson. She's got the whole board and the law firm on her side. We're just two people. You're wrong, Henderson said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You think she had you cornered? She didn't. She had you right where she wanted you, but she didn't have you cornered. She just changed the rules. He looked around again and then motioned for Mark to follow him. He led him to a small, secluded bench under a large oak tree that bordered both of their properties. What you found, that Project Oasis document, Henderson began. I remember it. It was a preliminary draft from a presentation by an outside firm, a consulting firm, the one that designed the pool. It was supposed to be a private meeting just with the board members before we presented it to the community. But Eleanor wanted a full, flashy presentation. The firm was going to handle everything, the design, the fundraising, the construction. They were even going to manage the pool for the first 5 years for a fee, of course. So what? It was their plan, Mark said, growing impatient. She's still using our water source. No, you don't understand, Henderson said, his voice now a mix of urgency and hushed excitement. That's the beauty of it. You're missing the forest for the trees? The Project Oasis isn't just a new pool. It's a complete overhaul of the community's water management system. It's a multi-million-dollar contract. The firm that designed it, you know who owns it? Mark shook his head, a glimmer of a thought beginning to form in his mind. Eleanor's husband, Richard Vance, Henderson said, a small, knowing smile on his face. He owns Vance Water Solutions. He was going to use his wife on the board to get the contract, get the water from your land, and then sell it back to the community for a profit. The pool is just a front for a much bigger, much more lucrative deal. And the first fine was to scare you off the land. The second was to bankrupt you into submission. Mark felt the blood rush from his head. He thought he had seen a fight about water rights, but this wasn't about water. This was about money. A massive, calculated, premeditated act of corporate greed, using the HOA as a front. Eleanor Vance wasn't just a rule-obsessed busybody. She was a criminal, using her position to enrich her family. He had been so focused on the injustice of the fine that he had completely missed the larger, more sinister plot. Henderson reached into the pocket of his shorts and pulled out a small, folded pamphlet. The draft you found was from the private meeting. The one they didn't want anyone to see. The one where they outlined the full scope of the project. I kept a copy. I resigned from the board a few weeks later. I knew what they were doing. I knew it was dirty, but I couldn't fight them. Not alone. But with you. You just gave us all the legal ammunition we need to take her down. Because what she did to you wasn't a fine. It was an illegal seizure of property rights. And now we've got her. Mark's mind reeled. The fine, the humiliation, the isolation. It all suddenly made perfect sense. It wasn't a small, petty HOA dispute anymore. It was a scandal. And he was standing on the precipice of a full-blown war, not just with a neighbor, but with a corporation and a corrupt board. He looked at Henderson, a man he had dismissed as just another neighbor, and felt a surge of adrenaline, not of fear, but of righteous rage. He was no longer a victim. He was a threat. And he was about to prove it. The crumpled document in his pocket suddenly felt like a weapon. He had walked into a trap, but he was about to turn the tables. He was about to expose the woman who had tried to bury him. The game had changed, and he had just found a new and unexpected way to win. He looked back at his dam, the monument to his labor, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't a fool. He was just the first to see the truth. And now, he was going to make sure everyone else saw it too. The crumpled pamphlet in Mark's hand no longer felt like a worthless relic. It felt like a stone forged in the fires of injustice, heavy with the weight of its truth. He looked at Henderson, the old man's face a roadmap of long-held resentment and quiet resolve, and a powerful sense of clarity washed over him. He wasn't just a man fighting for his pond. He was a man fighting to expose a lie. "She's a lawyer, Mr. Henderson," Mark said, his voice now calm and steady. "She'll just say we stole it. She'll say it's a fake. She'll try." Henderson replied, a grim smile on his face. But it's a copy of a real document. I have the original. I was on the board, remember? I have minutes, I have emails. I have the paper trail that proves they held that meeting, that they reviewed this proposal, and that they knew full well about your land's water source before a single fine was ever levied. What she did, what they all did, was a premeditated act of deception. And now we're going to prove it. The battle lines had been redrawn. This wasn't a skirmish in a meeting room anymore. It was a full-scale information war. That night, their house became a strategic command post. Sarah, with her sharp mind and an artist's eye for detail, designed the flyer. It was simple but devastatingly effective. One side showed a large, clean heading. They fined him $50,000 for a dam. They're getting a free pool with his water. Below that, two clear images, the fine letter and a photo of the Project Oasis document with the damning paragraph circled in red. The other side of the flyer detailed the plot, how Eleanor Vance's husband, Richard, owned the company that stood to gain a multi-million-dollar contract from the deal, and how the fines had been a calculated scheme to bankrupt Mark and seize his property's water. Henderson brought over his own contribution, a packet of photocopied HOA meeting minutes and a handwritten affidavit. This authenticates it, he said, tapping the papers. It proves the document is real and that I, a former board member, can attest to its validity. It's the final nail in their coffin. They worked through the night, a silent, determined team. The whirring of the photocopier was the only sound in the house, a low, mechanical hum of quiet revolution. They had 200 flyers, one for every house in Providence Oaks. The plan was simple but required flawless execution. They would distribute the flyers just before sunrise when the streets were empty and the neighborhood was still asleep. Then they would post the full, authenticated story, along with the affidavit, on the neighborhood's private social media page. They wouldn't just be reacting to the HOA's moves anymore. They would be controlling the narrative. At 4:30 a.m., Mark and Sarah, dressed in dark clothes, moved through the subdivision like ghosts. Mark drove their pickup truck, its engine a low purr. Sarah, nimble and quick, darted from mailbox to mailbox, a stack of flyers clutched in her hand. The air was cool and damp, the world a hazy canvas of gray and blue. Every rustle of a leaf, every distant dog bark felt like a thunderclap. The tension was a living thing crawling under Mark's skin. One wrong move, one neighbor waking up, and their entire plan could be exposed. They finished just as the first sliver of sunlight pierced the horizon. They drove home in silence, the empty box of flyers a testament to their victory. Mark parked the truck and they went inside. Sarah immediately logged on to the neighborhood's private Facebook group, where the online discussions and gossip typically centered around lost cats and lawn care. She posted the entire story, the documents, and Henderson's affidavit. Then she hit send. The neighborhood woke up to chaos. The first hint of it was the sound of distant murmuring, a low buzz that grew and grew. Mark and Sarah sat on their front porch, a steaming mug of coffee in hand, watching as the quiet suburban morning exploded into a whirlwind of activity. Neighbors emerged from their homes to get the morning paper, only to find a flyer on their porch. They would pick it up, their brow furrowed in confusion, and then their eyes would widen in shock as they read the words. Some would immediately pull out their phones, scrolling through the Facebook post. Others would start walking toward their neighbor's house, holding the paper, their faces a mix of disbelief and outrage. The Vance's house, the one with the impeccably manicured lawn, was at the center of the storm. Mark saw Eleanor standing on her driveway, her face a mask of furious disbelief as she read the flyer. Her husband, Richard, a portly, well-dressed man Mark had only seen from a distance, came out and snatched the flyer from her hand, his face turning a mottled red as he read it. He began shouting into his phone, his voice a furious, panicked roar. The phone calls started soon after. Mark's cell rang, and it was Mr. Jenkins from 2 doors down, his voice trembling with outrage. "Mark, what is this?" "Is this true? Is this really what they were doing?" Mark calmly confirmed it. "It's all true, Mr. Jenkins, every word. Within an hour, the digital world was a firestorm." The story had been shared and reshared. The comment section of the Facebook post was a torrent of anger and condemnation. People were demanding answers, demanding a special meeting, demanding the resignation of the entire board. A new call came in, but this time it was from a number Mark didn't recognize. He answered it, and a voice, cold and laced with venom, spoke on the other end. "You've made a terrible mistake, Mr. Lawson," Eleanor Vance said, her voice stripped of all pretense of civility. "You think you've won? You've only succeeded in bringing more ruin upon yourself? We'll sue you for libel, for defamation, and for illegal dissemination of private information. You'll be in a court for the rest of your life." "You can try," Mark said, the fear that had once plagued him now completely gone. He looked at Sarah and she gave him a small, triumphant smile. "But 150 people just read the truth, Eleanor, and I have an affidavit from a former board member to back it up. You tried to ruin me, and now you're going to have to face what you did. I'm not running anymore. The fight is just beginning." He hung up the phone just as another truck pulled up to his house, this one belonging to Mr. Miller, the HOA vice president. His face was pale. "Mark," he said, running a hand through his hair, "the Vances. They want us to issue a statement. To tell everyone you're a liar." Mark held up the flyer. "Tell them I'm waiting for the apology," he said, a cold, hard resolve in his eyes. That night, a special community meeting was called. But this time it was a meeting of the residents, not the board. The room, which had been so cold and indifferent just a week prior, was now packed to the rafters. Neighbor after neighbor stood and told their story, of the frustration with the Vances, of the rising costs, of the petty rules, and the constant intimidation. A motion was made to hold a vote of no confidence in the entire board, effective immediately. The vote was unanimous. Then another motion was made, this time by Mr. Henderson himself. "I move that, in recognition of the HOA's illegal and fraudulent actions, all fines levied against Mr. Mark Lawson be nullified," Henderson announced, his voice booming with authority. "And furthermore, that we, as a community, come together to help him finish his project." The motion was seconded, and the vote was taken. Hands shot up all over the room. Mark watched, his heart swelling with an emotion he hadn't felt in months. He had won. Not just a legal victory, but a moral one. His fines were gone, his reputation restored. And as the room erupted in applause, a new and powerful sense of irony settled over him. They had tried to take his water to build a pool, but in the end, they had given him a community. His fight had become their fight. And now the true neighborhood pool was about to be built. Eleanor Vance stood in her living room, a pristine space of white carpets and glass tables, and felt the perfect order of her life crumble around her. Her face, a mask of cold fury, was now streaked with unshed tears of rage. Richard, his face a mottled purple, paced the room, his expensive loafers sinking into the plush pile of the rug. He had been screaming into his phone for the last hour, but his fury had met with silence. Their lawyers had advised them to stand down, their public relations firm had already dropped them, and the board members had gone dark, their phones turned off. The unanimous vote of no confidence had been broadcast across the neighborhood chat, a public digital execution. "They're acting like a mob," Eleanor hissed, her voice trembling. She clutched a crumpled flyer, the stark, damning words mocking her from the page. "It's not a mob, Eleanor," Richard snarled, his voice a low growl. "It's the truth. And we never should have let that old man walk away with a copy of that damn proposal. I told you were getting too cocky. I was not cocky. He was a nobody, a simple man who built a dirt pile. Who would have thought he had a co-conspirator?" She spat, her eyes narrowed. The defeat was a bitter taste in her mouth. She had built her life on control, on the meticulous enforcement of rules. But Mark Lawson, the man who had dared to get his hands dirty, had just exposed the rotten core of her perfect little kingdom. "This isn't over," Richard said, his tone turning colder, more dangerous. "They can vote us out, but we still have a legal case. Libel, defamation, illegal dissemination of private information. That's still $100,000 they owe us. That's still a weapon." "A weapon they can now turn on us," Eleanor retorted, her mind already racing, calculating their next move. She looked out the window at the perfect green lawns of her neighborhood, and the sight of her neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, walking to a meeting with a dozen other neighbors, All of them looking in the direction of Mark's house sent a shiver of dread down her spine. The old power structures had been dismantled overnight. Mark Lawson had a new kind of power now. The power of a community united. Mark's front yard, which had been a desolate place of shame and isolation for weeks, was now a bustling hub of activity. Cars lined the street. Neighbors, once distant and suspicious, now stood side by side, their hands caked with mud, their faces streaked with sweat. The dam, which had been a monument to his failure, was now a symbol of their collective strength, Mr. Jenkins. The banker from 2 doors down was there in a pair of old work boots and a faded t-shirt, operating a rented mini-excavator. "Never thought I'd be doing this," he said to Mark, his face split in a wide grin. But there's something about moving earth for a good cause. Sarah, her hair tied back in a messy bun, was directing a line of teenagers who were moving buckets of river stones to shore up the foundation of the dam. She was no longer just his worried wife. She was a project manager, a general, a force of nature. Even Mr. Henderson, with his shock of white hair, was there, supervising the work with a serene joy that Mark had never seen before. He was no longer the cautious, worried neighbor. He was a leader, a man vindicated. "We're building something more than a dam here, Mark," Henderson said, leaning on a shovel, his eyes sweeping across the scene. "We're building a community. We're building back the trust she destroyed." Mark stood there, his hands in his pockets, a lump in his throat. He had spent months working on this project alone, fueled by stubbornness and a fierce love for his family. Now, an entire neighborhood had descended upon his property, armed with shovels, rakes, and a sense of shared purpose. The laughter, the camaraderie, the sheer physical energy of it all was overwhelming. This wasn't about a pond anymore. This was about reclamation. The day ended with a golden sunset, casting long, peaceful shadows over the completed dam. The water had begun to collect, a sheet of mirrored glass reflecting the fiery sky. The air, once heavy with the tension of his struggle, was now filled with the sound of cheerful exhaustion and the distant laughter of children. The neighborhood had not only nullified his fines, they had completed his project, turning his private dream into a shared reality. And then, just as the last of the neighbors were packing up their tools, the black SUV glided to a stop on the road. Richard Vance got out first, his face a grim mask of resolve. Eleanor followed, dressed in a sharp, businesslike suit, her jaw set. They walked slowly toward the dam, a final, desperate act of confrontation. The small crowd around Mark fell silent. He stood his ground, a wave of familiar fear tinged with anger washing over him. The old power dynamic was back, a ghost from a past he thought he had exorcised. Eleanor stopped a few feet from him, her eyes scanning the dam, her lips pursed in a thin, disapproving line. She looked at the fresh earth, the compacted soil, the gathering water, and then at the community of people standing with Mark. She turned to him, her voice a low, icy whisper. "Look what you've done, Mr. Lawson," she said, her eyes flicking to the faces of the people around him. "You've turned them into a mob. You've divided this community." "I didn't divide them, Mrs. Vance," Mark said, his voice quiet but firm. "You did. I just showed them what you were hiding." Richard stepped forward, a flash of red in his face. "We have a right to our property. You illegally obtained confidential information. We're not the ones who broke the law." "The community has spoken, Richard," a voice from the crowd said. It was Mr. Miller, the former vice president. He stepped forward, his face a mix of shame and newfound courage. "And we're not a mob. We're your neighbors. We're not going to let you profit from our community's resources at the expense of one of our own." The dam, now an undeniable presence on Mark's property, stood between them, a silent testament to the new order. The water shimmered, clear and placid, a symbol of everything the Vances had tried to take. Eleanor's facade finally cracked. She looked from Mark to the crowd, and for the first time she saw not a group of people she could manipulate, but a wall she could not break. She saw the quiet resolve in their faces, the collective strength in their posture. She had always controlled the narrative, but now the story was out of her hands. A small child. Lily ran up to the edge of the pond, her giggling voice a beacon of pure joy. and threw a handful of small stones into the water. The ripples spread out in perfect circles, a quiet, beautiful disruption to the silent tension. Eleanor Vance's eyes followed the ripples, and for a fleeting moment, a flash of pure, unfiltered envy crossed her face. The irony was a bitter, perfect pill. The free neighborhood pool she and her husband had planned to build for profit was a sterile, imagined place of concrete and chlorine. The one she was now forced to watch, the one the entire community had come together to build, was a small, tranquil pond on a piece of land she had tried to control and failed. The victory was complete. It wasn't just a dam. It was a pool of their own making, a pool of providence, and she was on the outside looking in, her dream of corporate profit drowned by the quiet power of a community she had underestimated and lost.